So I'm going to be presenting a few findings today based on my book. The larger work isn't just about structure and culture, and I'll get into why I use those terms rather than lumping them together as people are sometimes want to do. It deals with the convergence of structural factors, culture, health disparities, and social networks, and the way these things converge to stratify later life for the aging American population. So one of the questions I always get asked as a stratification person, why do I study later life? Right? Why not study children? They say children are our future. Well, it's not entirely true. The population is aging, and in addition to the pragmatic and policy needs associated with this, older individuals provide a lot of analytical leverage for understanding how inequality works out in everyday life. In the case of the U.S., it's one of only 2 points in the life course where we have a concerted and acknowledged intervention into inequality. We have it in youth with the promise of schooling, and we know how that works out or how that doesn't work out. And you have it in later life with the promise of entitlements like health care and a pension, which is not something that we have anywhere else. But there's another more theoretical reason. So this could speak to the policy issues, how those interventions work, but it also provides a place, and again, a unique spot in the life course, where people from different backgrounds face convergent problems in a way that you wouldn't necessarily see in middle age. So in later life, people tend to have a series of physical problems, later life here being defined by time from the end. In America, they have to face the fact that quite often there's a bias towards youth. It's well documented in employment, it's well documented in health, it's well documented in interactions ranging from getting mortgages to buying something at the corner store. And many have to come to deal with the deaths of friends and loved ones, health problems, network shrinkages, etc. So although there's been a push to emphasize, if you will, the more positive aspects of aging, there are shared practical predicaments that structure people's lives. And this allows us to trace out what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu referred to as similarly shaped problems of social action. So by selecting these similar problems, we look at how people from different backgrounds, different paths, different neighborhoods leverage different resources to navigate their social world. And it allows us insight into how mechanisms like material inequalities, culture, networks, etc., affect the options that people have at the end of life. That is to say, how stratification works. And unlike children who are important, I have a new child, she's very important to me, but older people have already been exposed to a lifetime of inequality. So this allows us to trace some of these temporal links that haven't yet been established in the case of children. So it provides another analytical angle. So in short, old age provides a useful and, in my opinion, drastically underutilized lens for understanding American inequality. It's a fruitful site for social theory. It's important practically and on a human level, which is not of no consequence. And there are few comparative ethnographic studies of how this plays out across contexts. So that's why I study old age. So in studying this, as a diehard empiricist, I began with 2 empirical questions. The first is, how do mechanisms of inequality that have been established in other studies, structural inequalities, culture, etc., shape everyday life for older Americans, pragmatically defined at the outset of the project as those 60 and over? And the caveat, as some of you may be thinking, 60 isn't necessarily that old. However, people age biologically at different rates. So if you're from an upper middle class background, you have access to good medicine, you don't work in toxic environments, 60 may indeed be the new 40, but if you are in an inner city poverty neighborhood selling your body in order to accrue income, that's going to wear out a lot faster. So I had to select that lower threshold, right, the age 60, in order to maximize variation. Because if I had selected, say, 85, something that would be commonly acknowledged as old across all groups, then I would essentially select out a number of the disadvantaged, and these are also the people that are, less likely to even make it to 60. So I already have that selection bias. A related question is, how do women and men from different demographic groups in different neighborhoods manage the demands of aging in everyday life? And it's important to note the limitations of this as an ethnographic study. I'm not attempting to determine whether or not there's a correlation between inequality and aging, between inequality and health. In fact, we know there is. It's well documented. It plays out in terms of who lives to grow old, the physical issues that they have there, but rather how these micro, meso, and macro relationships converge in everyday life to shape the options and experiences that are available to people. So I'm not attempting to redo the demographic literature, the epidemiological literature. I take that as a starting point for investigating how these relationships play out on the ground. So puzzles like, why do some of the seniors that I spent years of time with go to a doctor every time they have a sniffle? I tend to be in that category. Why do others wait until they have to go to the ER? My mother tends to be in that category. Why do we see variation even within socioeconomic strata and racial groups, something that might be problematic if you were to have operationalized culture in an unnuanced way? And a frustration of mine in my quantitative work, why do people that look essentially identical, or at the very least very similar on a survey, consistently behave in ways that are different? So my goal in answering all these questions, or trying to answer all these questions, you'll have to decide whether or not I do it adequately, hopefully more adequately in the book than in the quick talk, is to get at how these mechanisms of inequality converge to shape everyday life more generally. So that's what I'm shooting for as a theoretical contribution. So I'm going to talk a little bit about methodology, because this is in part a methodology talk, and I love talking about methodology. I'll talk for the entire time, but I'll try not to do that because it's sociology too. The study was based in 2.5 years of participant observation, which I did in 4 different urban neighborhoods. I paired this with 60 in-depth interviews with women and men from different racial and socioeconomic groups. The observations contributed important things to the study. They allowed me to see how physical and social dilemmas played out in everyday life. So when somebody is having arthritis and they're having a harder time moving around, how does that work out in a sort of rich neighborhood that has a lot of mobility modifications versus in a poor neighborhood that has cracked pavement? How do problems vary between contexts? So how do they look different across the different neighborhoods? But also where there were points of convergence, right, where problems were shared across groups, where you do actually see things of that nature. And then, ultimately, how people navigated these issues in everyday life. And of course, shouldn't have to say this, but I always do, when I say participant observation, yes, I was asking questions, I was spending time in the neighborhoods, I was not silently sitting there, because that is just a very, very awkward thing to do. And I say that, and I have a high bar for awkward. So the interviews, which I conducted mostly at the end of the study, provided more explicit data about life histories and prior experiences with inequality. So I could have a brief conversation with somebody as they're going to the doctor, I'm following them around, etc. But the interviews would allow me to do this in a more formal way to help trace out some of these temporal links, albeit imperfectly imputed from interviews. They also allowed me to get at cultural factors, so the way that people explain and justify their behaviors, what they consider to be a normative, an acceptable, or a non-acceptable form of behavior through vignettes and saying, I saw somebody that did this. how do you interpret that? And some would say that's totally reasonable. I could understand why they don't go to the doctor. And somebody else would say that's asinine. They're being irresponsible to their family. So it allowed me to get at these different interpretations of events that I was observing, and both allowed me to get access to how seniors made sense of these things as they went about their everyday lives. So they would tell me while I was doing the interviews, I'd observe what they were doing, and then they'd tell me while I was in the field. So a little bit on the neighborhoods. So I selected 4 neighborhoods in Northern California. I'm happy to talk more about sampling using census data. And the idea wasn't just to select a single neighborhood with demographic variation, that is, on socioeconomic or racial characteristics, but given the whole extensive, probably 100 years now, of evidence about the importance of neighborhood effects to see if this in fact was operating. So I can't see the effects of different neighborhoods if I select only a single neighborhood. So it wasn't enough to do this sort of single site ethnographic study. I apologize for the crude abbreviations, but if I wrote things out, it would be even harder to see. But basically, my sites varied on whether they were poor or not poor, right? On average, poor being something like 40% of households were living below the poverty line for a household of that size, and whether or not they were relatively racially mixed, which you see in some areas in the US, but not others. So I have Rockport, and all of these are pseudonyms because in each of the neighborhoods there were things going on that people wouldn't necessarily want to share. Some of them are illegal things dealing with the markets, and that's what the IRB says I have to do regardless. So Rockport was poor, racially mixed, largely African American, Latino, but also substantial numbers of whites and Asian Pacific Islanders. Elm Flats was more segregated. It was predominantly poor, but it was mostly African Americans with some whites that showed up or that lived there. Cedar Hills was middle class and racially mixed, and Bay Gardens was middle class and more racially homogeneous. And the different dynamics of these neighborhoods, and in particular the provision of service across neighborhoods, turns out to be a major factor in explaining why people have different experiences later in life. So just very quickly, talking a little bit about the research process, the methodological underpinnings. I started by going to various neighborhoods, and I spent time in places where seniors congregated. So initially, this was it included things like senior centers, housing facilities, hospitals, and pharmacies. As I got to know more seniors, I expanded this to include coffee shops, libraries, bars, and corner stores. Once I was in these places, doing my sort of distance observations, examining how people dealt with the challenges of everyday life, I would introduce myself, I'd build rapport with them, I'd go with them to bingo, I watched a lot of daytime TV, all these sorts of things to become sort of part of their world, and they were gracious enough to let me spend time with them as they'd go to the doctor or as they'd attempt to get something from the store. So I became friends with quite a few of them. And although the focus was prior to institutionalization, I did observations in a number of nursing facilities. One, because people visit their friends and their families in these locations, and I would follow them as they did that. But I thought it would also be useful to embed myself in two, one in Rockport, the other in Bay Gardens, and I did sort of pseudo-volunteer work where I would go visit with different residents for probably about a year. The last year, I did these interviews, and I was lucky to have some research assistants that helped with that as well. And then by the end of the project, I did the now relatively typical iterative analysis using computer-assisted qualitative data analysis, where I looked at existing and new themes and attempted to make sense of it. And the one point that I want to make before I go on to actual findings is that the results in the book and the talk are not anthropological composites. They're not stories that I selected because they're interesting. Each one is indicative of either a general pattern that was seen repeatedly during field work or something that was an outlier, that was an exceptional case that allows us to understand something about the larger social system. So, the end game. So this is sort of a bird's eye view of how different forms of social inequality shape later life. And then I'm going to walk through with data, as much as I have time, and talk a little bit about specific mechanisms. I would like to mention why I use this metaphor of the game. The first thing I would say is I don't use the metaphor of the game to trivialize it or because I'm attempting to add humor or lyricism or anything of that nature. I do it because I think it's a useful analogy, and we often understand the world through analogy. So, like games, later life has active players, people making decisions, engaging in actions, has organizing mechanics that limit what we could do, what's considered acceptable to do. It has temporal phases, right? So innings, quarters, etc., just like life has different phases. People use different styles and strategies. That is, not everybody approaches the FIFA World Championship or the Super Bowl the same way, right? You have different ways of going about that. It's relational in the sense that even if it is a single-person sport like tennis, it takes place in the larger context of a network of people. There are winners and losers. Some reach the ends that they want, others not so much. And often, and this is, if you follow the news with FIFA or you follow the Super Bowl, you know this is the case. Games often purport to be fair when in fact they are not. So I focus on 5 aspects in the book, and I'll talk a little about each in the talk. Who gets to play, the organizing mechanics of the game, the shape of the playing field, which is in fact quite uneven in the US, the strategies of play, that is why people pursue different approaches to the game, even when they're within the same racial or socioeconomic or gender grouping. So things dealing with culture, motivations, orientations, symbolic capacities for action, and team dynamics and the role of networks, which is something probably not going to talk as much about in the talk today. So the first point, and I can't stress this enough, especially if there are policy people involved, is that a lot of this inequality, right, a lot of the socioeconomic and racial factors that structure our opportunities in America play out before you even get to old age, before you get to 60, certainly before you get to 85. And demographers talk about this a lot. They refer to it as selective mortality. And this is essentially the process whereby the poor, the socially marginalized, etc., die before they even get a chance to face a lot of the challenges that I'm going to describe. They also face physiological challenges earlier. So this is a point where biomedical science is actually catching up to Durkheim and then Foucault, where they had shown that inequality essentially inscribes itself on the body. There's extensive work on telomere length, suggesting that this is true even on a genetic level, that your social circumstances affect the extent to which your body wears out. The disadvantaged also have more health problems over the course of their life, so by time they get to these final innings, they tend to be more beat up, if you will. They've taken more shots, not only through manual labor, but also living in toxic environments, higher levels of stress, other forms of deprivation. And the general literature, I think, is summarized well by the sociologists Jeremy Fries and Karen Letfi, and this is one of my favorite quotes on this because it's so pointed. The lower status people are, the sooner they die and the worse health they have while alive. And this is something that we see internationally. It's something that we talk about at RC 28. So the point here is that much of this plays out before my study, although I did observe the relative level of health problems people from different groups had. But the point is the most disadvantaged typically don't even get the chance to play the end game. And that in and of itself is a really important aspect of inequality. So here's where I pick up, the shared challenges. So while the onset of old age varies, and you could see this in 15-year differences in life expectancy and whatnot, somebody from the upper classes, somebody that's not a racial minority, would be expected to have a longer life expectancy than their peer. Once people face these sort of these issues, they have a set of shared experiences often related to their bodies and the way that people respond to those bodies. So Tom, who was a former financier, 64-year-old white guy, again, pseudonym from Bay Gardens, who got to his golden years without enough gold, that was his quote, I thought that was very clever, broke down the predicaments that people face, the similarly shaped dilemmas of growing old in America, pretty systematically. So this was something a lot of people talked about, but he kind of hits a lot of the key points. So he says, quote, "So I'm really physically a wreck, and I'm very, very concerned about being able to live by myself because I've lost a lot of the flexibility that I used to have." He continues, "Seniors are a tough crowd. They're old, by definition. They're cranky. They're often in bad health. They're frequently in mourning for, family or compatriots. And lastly, they're basically sniffing their own mortality, which is, it's a tough, tough crowd." So he was, had a fairly harsh view of aging that might run in the face of some of the accounts of holding hands on the beach at the end of life. And this is somebody that brought immense advantages with him into later life. It's telling that when I asked interviewees to describe what later life was like, I just said I was interested in aging, physical issues came up in every single interview without variation. And there was a general acknowledgement that circumstances that would be annoying in your 30s or in your 20s became a game changer once you hit 80 or, depending on the neighborhood, maybe 60. And the joke that they used to tell was we're all one fall away from the home. And what that means is the home being the nursing home, we're all very close to a life-changing event that could go quite bad. And the reason this joke was bandied around, you saw it across different neighborhoods, was because it had a certain resonance and bite in that it reflected an underlying reality about physical vulnerability as they aged. So an interesting side effect, or something that I talk about more in the book, not really side effect, is that people from different walks of life had a set of experiential shifts in ways you wouldn't see at other points. So James, who was a 77-year-old African-American man from Rockport who grew up in the segregated South, had a great quote. It was one of the most articulate, I think, but certainly not atypical in any sense in terms of the themes. James notes, "No one understands, quote, no one understands being old but old people. That's just an event that happens and it's catastrophic. You can't change it. When you get old, everything is a chore. Everything you do is a chore. Just getting up in the morning is a chore because you can't sleep the same, you can't eat the same, you can't walk the same, and you don't have the same dreams. Everything changes. Old is a different animal altogether," and I borrowed that for a chapter title. The only way you can understand it is you have to get there. So I think a relatively poetic, yet still quite grim understanding of what it means to enter the final phases of life. I counterpose this with Lila, who was a white woman in Bay Gardens, a little less poetic, but perhaps more parsimonious, when she noted, "When you get old, things change how you think and how you feel." So these are people whose lives were separated by immense chasms, right, growing up in California and the Bay Area versus the segregated South, different occupations, different levels of education, different money and resources, yet in the end, they faced a set of similar challenges and experiences in a way that was sort of not seen earlier in the life course. Now, I think I skipped one too soon. The point is not that these experiential shifts are sui generis, but rather they're grounded in a shared reality, and a reality that tells us about stratification. particularly that the degeneration of the body, what the presumed degeneration of the body, what an aged body signifies in interactions with others, becomes an axis of stratification in and of itself, and that this leads to a set of convergent experiences. So the issue was summed up by a retired teacher in Bay Gardens who had another one of these great quotes when she said, "You don't realize how precious the body is until you grow old." Or as my grandma said, health is wealth. So sociologists, of course, have been discussing this for a long time, since Marx noted that the body is a primary resource for the laboring class. James could be paraphrasing Bourdieu in a certain sense, but the point empirically is that if you want to understand how later life works out, you have to look at the body, even if it makes you uncomfortable. It's an instrument that we use to act in the world. It's a fundamental resource that we use to construct lines of action. And quite often it's a signifier that affects how people treat us. And this is something that came up quite often in terms of status and identity, particularly those who were from less materially advantaged backgrounds. If your ability to be the baddest guy on the block, or you were acknowledged as, a true beauty, where beauty is equated with youth, and those things decline in later life, it affects your ability to construct an identity. So there's a lot of continuity between past and present, but also new challenges in that people treat you differently. And at the extreme, and this is something that I observe as well, the body limits what in fact is possible in later life. The body itself becomes a fundamental structure. So Dave from Elm Flats, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about Dave in a bit, explained to me what it means to be, in his words, not mine, old and broken. He explained in an afternoon, I was sitting in his apartment, when he was young, if he wanted a six-pack, he'd go across the street. Right? He wasn't living in a food desert. There was a store across the street. When he wanted food, he'd go to the market. If he wanted a joint, he'd talk to his friend. If he wanted sex, he'd go to a bar. Again, his words. Now, none of this was possible. Even though he was sharp, he was clever, he had mental acuity, he described having similar drives, and the way he put it was that his body was essentially the limiting factor in what was available in his social life. He says, quote, "I think I'm a Ferrari, but I can't get out of third gear. I get about 2 hours of good energy a day where it's safe for me to move around and do things." And once he hit that threshold, he was in that at-risk for fall category. He was not in great health, something that was in fact influenced by his previous manual occupations and a series of health issues that he had earlier. In the even more extreme case, Jason, who was a 76-year-old white man in a nursing facility who had led quite a colorful life, explained to me, "I'm an action man and there is no action here," talking about his life in the nursing home. At this point, he raised his voice and he said, "I raced cars and I flew planes." He also sailed boats, and we talked a lot about that. He had a better sense of direction than I did. He continued, "I just sit around all week dying and watching others waiting to die. I'm a fucking cripple and I can't go out. You depend on them, here, the nurses, the staff, etc., for everything. They control your biology." And so, while the body determines many aspects of social life, what it signifies in interactions to others, something that's important across the life course, it's not possible to pull this out of old age and attempt to understand the way the end game works. It becomes a powerful structuring access for people across neighborhoods. It's not the only access, but it's not something that we could ignore because biology makes us uncomfortable. So, structural factors. Well, the body is in fact a structuring element in social life. Structures our experiences and our possibilities. The capacities for responding to predicaments like a degenerating body, arthritis, the death of one's pet, the death of one's neighbor, the death of one's children, is contingent on inequalities both past and present. And inequalities in the most traditional sociological sense of resources. So different resources an individual brings into later life, whether or not they have wealth, whether or not they have a pension that was associated. Again, not having a reasonable pension is not a given in this context. That was associated with their previous work, whether or not they have good health insurance or they have to use state health insurance, and whether or not they own a home, the primary axis of wealth in America for most families. And some people have all these advantages to deal with arthritis, to deal with cancer, to deal with people treating them differently when they go into a store. They have different things they can mobilize. And others face them alone with relatively few. So in effect, some have a huge advantage, and these are not randomly distributed. They follow the race, class, and gender schisms that we see throughout the life course in America. But neighborhood context is key as well. So it's not reducible to something like an individual story of bodies and resources. And this is seen in my study in the difference between Bay Gardens, so that middle class, primarily white and Asian area, and Rockport, which was a mixed poor area. So even if people had the same resources individually, there were differences in their neighborhood that affected how they in fact could respond. So Bay Gardens, I don't want to say was a utopia for seniors, but comparatively they were much better off. They had great public transit for seniors, so mobility modifications, bus service where they'd come pick you up at your home, drive you around. They had good hospitals, which a lot of these people spent a lot of time at the doctor, so having good care providers mattered. They had all sorts of senior programs. They had food, they had tax help, they had seminars on taxes, which was a challenge that a lot in the poor areas didn't have. Their housing, if they lived in subsidized housing, was well maintained. There was a surplus of volunteers who would visit them, bring them food, drive them around, and these were things that just were not there in Rockport. These services were not there. In Rockport, they did have public transportation, California being sort of the conservative case, right? This is urban rather than rural. So again, compared to somebody living in the Central Valley of California, they're relatively advantaged. But still, the public transportation available to people was spotty. So they could take buses, which don't necessarily run on time and don't necessarily show up. But importantly, these sort of free buses, only for seniors, which were also an important site of sociability and recreation, didn't run there. They didn't have them. They had lower quality hospitals. They had fewer senior programs. These programs were more geographically dispersed. The subsidized housing was, to put it nicely, poorly maintained. They didn't have somebody coming and fixing a broken light the next day. These were very different, more challenging physical environments. And even among those who did volunteer, because people did try and help out their friends and neighbors and seniors, there was a focus on youth. So even churches, which could be a major access of help for those who are part of that community, were more geared towards helping youth get out of the neighborhood than helping seniors who were stuck in the neighborhood. All this was compounded by something like an entrepreneurial funding system where the grant process allowed different organizations to apply for money to improve seniors' lives, which is something that one might say is a useful goal, whether you're middle class or you're in a poor area. However, the way that this worked is that the ability to get grants is based on prior experience getting and administering grants. It's based on formal organizations rather than informal networks. And all of these things privilege the middle class and affluent areas. So you saw a sort of compensatory inversion where the limited resources were not only being competed for, but were being filtered into the most affluent areas. So to go from sort of abstraction to something pretty concrete, what happens when people run out of Insure? Do you have Insure in the UK? Okay, so I'll say what it is. Insure is essentially a nutritional supplement. It's actually a pretty sugary one but people use it for responding to cancer when you can't eat a lot of solid food. People use it in later life when they have a lot of digestive issues, they can't consume as much. So for many of the seniors in my study, this was a major way that they would get their nutrients, right? It was a major part of their diet. It was a sort of artificial can, which some say tastes like a milkshake and others say it tastes like something else. So here, what I do is I present a concrete example of what 3 different people do when they run out of Ensure. So this is something that's pretty hard to reduce to, say, an explanation about values, because really they all want the same thing in this case. They want Ensure. So I'm going to talk through each of these 3 people and going from relatively more options to relatively fewer options. So I start with Pauline. Pauline was a middle-class African-American woman who lived in Elm Flats. She was in good health. She owned a car. She had disposable income from her job and her savings. When she wanted to get Ensure, it was a relatively straightforward procedure. She could walk to the store, or she could drive to the store, and then she'd pay for it, right? Pretty straightforward. Laura, on the other hand, who was a middle-class white woman, had a slightly harder time. She couldn't drive. She had a lot of physical issues. She had an electric wheelchair, which she would be the first to admit she was not an expert at piloting. I told her I thought I would do worse. Her son would visit and take care of her. So he would come a couple times a week, bring food, etc. And this is something he saw as his duty, but physically she wasn't so well off. But in her case, her son brought her the Ensure, and if she didn't have that son, she also had money to hire a helper or an aide, and she could certainly pay for the cost of the Ensure. So her options were a bit more constrained by her physiological issues, but she still had options and was able to get the Ensure. Now we get to Dave. And Dave was a poor guy. He was, I introduced him earlier. He did manual labor previously in his life. He doesn't have a car. He doesn't have any close family. That is, anybody he could call and say, could you lay out this money and pick this up for me? He's relatively isolated. Now, he doesn't live in what public health people would call a food desert, and this may be an artifact of the California case. There was a store that was essentially 2 blocks away. But if you only have a couple hours of energy a day, if you have arthritis, it's hard to move around, you're on the top floor of a building that doesn't have an elevator, even if it's only 2 floors, 2 blocks away might as well be across town, right? It's unreachable. That space is not easy to navigate. And he was living in a neighborhood where senior transportation was spotty. So all these places still had the county agency that would come in, pick seniors up and drive them around, but the problem, which is indicated in a little phrase, is the seniors would say, they get you there, but. The but being they don't necessarily show up to pick you up. And I would say, they don't necessarily show up to take you there either. And this is something I've seen in my previous studies as well. It's just not, it's sort of a last resort. And even if he did have this, he didn't have money to hire somebody to go pick this up for him. And even then, if he went to the store, unlike the other 2, he didn't have $50 for a case of Ensure. And he drank quite a bit of Ensure. So what does he do? He has to engage in what is a relatively convoluted process. First, he calls his social worker, who insists that he goes to the doctor, even though this isn't a change in health. This is just, he wants his Ensure so he could meet his caloric requirements. This requires that he gets a ride to the doctor. He has no family to call upon. He does have some friends, but they don't necessarily have a car. So usually how he would get there is he would either bribe, essentially, the home health aide by saying he would sign off on additional hours so she would get paid more, or there would be some sort of informal exchange where he would offer somebody Vicodin, a narcotic painkiller, in exchange for that ride. In this case, he allowed me to go with him, and he thought it was a relatively fair exchange. we got along well, and he liked having me around, so it didn't seem like too much of an imposition. So at this point, he gets a ride to the clinic, the free clinic, where he has to, quote, jump through the hoops. And here, this is not something that he wants to do. He doesn't want to see the doctor. He doesn't want to interact with them. He doesn't want to deal with a social worker either. He goes to the clinic. He has to wait around. If you're the person that aggravates the desk staff, you could be waiting for quite a while. And keep in mind, this is somebody that has a really limited energy threshold. He would say afterwards it drained what energy he had. He'd have a 5-minute interview with the doctor, which would be fine. He liked his doctor. He didn't, dislike the doctor or anything to that effect. But essentially, it led to a cycle of medical engagement. So the way he put it, they all want to bill you for their 45 minutes. And this is a common point of skepticism espoused by seniors who were in this sort of circumstance. So the doctor's appointment begot more doctor's appointment. So in this case, the 5-minute checkup involved 3 new appointments. He had to see a hand surgeon, which was a bit ridiculous because he wasn't, healthy enough for surgery. The surgeon said this. He thought it was ridiculous. A podiatrist, he had a gangrenous foot, and another appointment with the GP, the general practitioner. From Dave's perspective, none of this was desirable. He used up all his energy. He could barely make it up the stairs to his apartment. There was no elevator in his apartment building. This wasn't his first choice. He explained he'd rather spend time with friends. He'd rather listen to music. He was a huge audiophile. The only upshot of the visit is he got his prescription for Ensure, which he had to recuperate before he could get somebody to take him and sort of fill that at the pharmacy 2 blocks away. And he got some Vicodin that he could use to barter. So a very different experience. In this case, there's a somewhat happy ending in that through clever navigation of bureaucracy, Dave was in fact able to get Ensure. But although people have different physical capacities and structural factors that limit what was possible, even in these cases, the point is not that culture, broadly defined as shared meanings, motivations, strategies, practical capacities, were totally unimportant. So in the case of Dave, we would say that his ability to deal with street-level bureaucrats, something that he developed by a lifetime of living on the margins, was instrumental in his ability to even get this thing, as opposed to being institutionalized or having a social worker come in and say, you are not able to take care of yourself, that's self-neglect, you're going to the state Medicaid home. In Laura's case, her relationship with her family was based on certain normative underpinnings, the expectation that if you have a mother that you help them, that this is not conditioned on something else. In Paula's case, the one that's the most direct, you don't see this as much from the story, but for her, taking care of things herself, being independent, was a key aspect of her identity, something that's seen across all these groups in the U.S. But still, the main story here is not one of culture, it's not one of different values. People want the same thing, they want Ensure, but they live in different contexts and have different resources for getting it. If you say what is the limiting factor, that in fact is a limiting factor. But what about when people are equipped for multiple possibilities? So if you have a doctor nearby and you have a folk healer nearby and neither is essentially financially prohibitive, which do you go to? And here, culture could play a much more direct role by shaping what I would call inputs, that is, the ends people will pursue and what they see as a reasonable way of pursuing those ends. And it does this, and it's something that I talk a lot about in the book, by shaping what we consider desirable, given our circumstances, what we consider reasonable, given the options available to us, and what we consider sensible and practical, given everything. And so this is necessary to understand how people that are equipped for multiple lines of action pursue the courses of action that they do. So that sounds jargony. I'm going to give you a much clearer example. Why does Jane skip chemo? And this is a puzzle that sort of epitomizes this. So Jane and Lainey were two white women. They both lived in Bay Gardens. They were very close to one another. They had a lot of similarities. In fact, they looked the same on some of the health surveys that I've used in my quantitative work. Both had early stage breast cancer that was highly treatable, or that they were told was highly treatable. Jane was a middle-class white woman. She had a college education, she had insurance, she had a car, she had friends. She knows that it's a bad move medically to skip chemo in the sense that this will shorten her life, or she expects that it will. It wasn't that she didn't understand that relationship, and it's something she acknowledged on several occasions. But she didn't go to chemotherapy, at least not regularly. She'd often skip it to go to jazz clubs, to visit with friends, to do things that she wanted to do. Lainey, on the other hand, another white woman down the street, and despite similar characteristics, she got chemotherapy religiously. Right? For her, doing anything else was, not only irrational, it was immoral. So here you have two very different behaviors, which are seen in larger patterns in my data that are not reducible to the points where I might advocate the first line of intervention. So information, access, resources, both of them had it. These were essentially invariant characteristics. They were in the same context, dealing with the same problem, and again, they looked the same on surveys like the National Health Interview Survey, which I've used in a project prior to this. It wasn't that Jane lacked cognitive flexibility or a sense of control. She was very adept at dealing with doctors. She was very sharp, very skilled at navigating it. But it was something that's more basic and at times more troubling, which is to say that in the insurer example, you have people that wanted the same thing and they had different resources. For some, it was really hard to get it. For others, it may be a complete impossibility. But in the chemo example, they had similar resources and they simply valued different things. So what this points to is the importance of these cultural inputs, motivations, and orientations that affect how people could respond to a problem, what they see as reasonable. And the fact is, and Jane was quite articulate about this, she didn't like feeling bad. She knew she was going to die at some point. She saw herself as already getting up there, and doing something that would make her live a few years longer and make her miserable at the time was seen as unreasonable. It was almost irresponsible to do that. In contrast, Loretta wanted to preserve her body, to preserve her independence as long as possible, and the idea that one would simply skip chemotherapy on a whim to go to a jazz club was totally incomprehensible to her. And these are parts of larger differences and motivational complexes where some seniors would attempt to preserve the body, others would maximize enjoyment, and both saw the other as taking the wrong approach. So this wasn't something you would say, oh, well, really this is a right thing, but I'm doing the wrong thing. Each saw the other as having a very flawed approach. So the question is, how is this culture, right? How is this not just individual personality? And the answer to that is that it's one based in prior experiences that are organized in large part by inequality, and it has a moral component, right? So this is something that's socially negotiated. Again, they didn't see these as two equally responsible ways of approaching life. Each saw the other as doing something that was fundamentally flawed. And again, these are not things that are sui generis. For Jane, you could understand this in the context of her life history. Earlier in life, she had a great deal of uncertainty. She had a health problem, rheumatoid arthritis. This led to trouble working. She often had to depend on people, become very clever at using her networks. And for her, given her gender and the time in which she was living, this often involved making relationships with men, something that she continued later into life. She explained to me that nothing lasts forever. So her response was to have fun when and where she could. To do anything else is to sort of fundamentally misunderstand the world. This was a driving force for her earlier in life. It affected how she approached things, and it was a driving force at the end. Whereas in her colleague, you saw the exact opposite. And these are divergent strategies that they developed, which are not just based in individual preferences, but cultural understandings that take place in the context of networks, capacities, and inputs that are developed over the course of their lives. They don't suddenly pop up in old age. Oh, that's a little bit cut off. So another example. Culture is not just motivations, it also involves orientations, what we see as reasonable responses. It involves our repertoire that we use to construct an identity, to construct a line of action. And I'm not going to get to all of this because, as I see, I'm already about 5 more minutes. I'm a little bit over time, ad-libbing. But I would like to mention this point of orientations, which are a second input into culture. And this is seen in the case of why Ray avoids a doctor while Bill goes. So again, I picked 2 people that have a lot of similar characteristics, but they pursue very different lines of action in a way that are both consistent and representative of broader patterns in my data. So both are relatively healthy, so neither of them are Dave. They're both getting around relatively well, good quality of life in that sense. Both have been recommended to see the doctor regularly, so neither of them have friends that say, oh, you shouldn't go to the doctor, that's a scam. Both have insurance. Again, having supplemental insurance in the U.S. is a big deal. It means you get better doctors, you don't have to pay out of pocket, you don't have to wait as long in order to see somebody, so that's a big factor. They have cars, they could access care. Bill is in a slightly nicer neighborhood, but again, going to the doctor is not outside of the realm of possibility. Both have friends that say, yeah, this is a smart thing to do. If you're sick, what do? Well, you don't try and sleep for 3 days, you go to the doctor. That's what we do. And importantly, both fall into this camp of preserving the body. Both attempted to maximize independence, to slow decline, rather than to say, damn the torpedoes, I want to have fun while I can, which was Jane's strategy. Yet, they behaved quite differently. Bill went to the doctor all the time, and Ray avoided the doctor like the plague. And this is driven towards different orientations, again, shaped in prior life experience that oriented them towards a medical or natural body. This affected how they approached health, what they saw as a role of doctors and other sort of medical authorities. Bill was relatively typical of those with the medical body orientation. When he noted, I have my doctor and we have a regular schedule. They draw my blood and I come home and have a meeting the following week and he and I check on everything. So there's a deference, a recognition that the doctor is the expert, that the doctor helps with the body. This is seen for a number of other people. I'll skip some quotes. But on the other hand, Ray, who was sort of representative of what I call the natural body orientation, had a very different take. When asked about why he didn't go to the doctor, he was pretty blunt in the way that I appreciated when he said, doctors are money-making schemes and bullshit systems and programs. Not a huge fan of doctors, certainly not deferring to them as the experts on biology and the management of his life. Another senior voiced a common experience when he said, doctors bug me because I know they're just juicing it for the money. And this was a point of contention, that doctors were these sort of upper-class people making tremendous income off of making seniors go to appointments they felt that they didn't need and that they didn't want. So how does he handle it? And this, again, is indicative of this strategy. He says, I rest, I see what sort of herbal concoctions sound best, but mostly I rest. The body heals itself. The body has all types of natural healing agents inside of it. You leave it alone instead of loading it up with chemicals. When you get a cut, I don't care how deep it is, all you have to do is stop the bleeding and it patches itself up. It's how nature works. So for him, he was the expert on his body. He knew it better than the doctor did. Nature takes its course. It doesn't require medical interventions, and doctors are there as sort of bureaucrats, street-level gatekeepers that affect what's available. And this is understandable if you knew a bit about Ray's background. So he had bad experiences with doctors early, as many of those who grow up in less affluent circumstances in the U.S. did. He was an African American. We have established patterns of racial discrimination in healthcare. The Tuskegee experiments, which were conducted on African Americans during the segregation era, were sort of large in the public imaginary. There's not a ton of trust going on. And between these things, the racism, the prior inequalities, insensitivity with providers, he had a much more cynical view of doctors and what they could accomplish. This is something that was shaped by his prior experiences and in turn shaped how we responded in later life. Okay, so I'll just get to the summary and the last points here. So I hope you find something interesting in this and that maybe you'll consider looking at the larger work. If I'm required to reduce this to a series of bullet points, which the format sort of demands that I do, the end game looks something like this. First, there's a great deal of inequality that affects who gets to play the end game, that is, who survives to the final innings. Among those that survive, there are shared problems and experiences based on the body and what it signifies in social life, becoming an old person in a context that doesn't necessarily value that. In the present, structural factors at both the neighborhood and individual level affect which options are available to us in a way that is not totally mitigated or erased by the provision of social services, the way what I would say the Pollyannish camp would say they are. In fact, they continue until the very end. But there's also tremendous complex variation. And you see this in why Jane skips chemo while her colleague goes. And for me, this variation is not something to be ignored or controlled out or subsumed into an error term. It's important. It's part of a pattern that we have trouble measuring. And what you see here is that culture is certainly a resource in that it's used strategically by people to pursue different ends, but it's also a temporal link that shapes what's desirable, what's reasonable, and what's sensible, what fits within the realm of possibility in the present, and this underpins some of these divergent strategies that you observe within a context, like the neighborhood of Bay Gardens or the neighborhood of Rockport. Networks, which I didn't talk about as much but are a major part of the book, sort of connect these things, if you will, and they do so not only by affecting who you know in a sort of 0-1 or you're more connected than another, but what these actually mean in context. So networks are underpinned by expectations about reciprocity, about who's worthy of help, etc., that affect whether or not you're going to go help your mother, or whether that's seen as an imposition on her and saying, well, you can't help yourself. The same thing with friends, and of course the fact that who you're connected to is not random. It's also a function of your social context, and being connected to somebody with a lot of resources provides you options that somebody else might not have. So I was going to go through implications. I'm going to skip implications. Happy to talk about implications. I just want to come back to the title of my talk and sort of end on that. This is something I did get some flack for earlier when people say, oh, you talk about structure and culture. This is a dichotomy that we've abandoned 30 years ago in social theory. And I say, yeah, that's true. As many have argued, these things are intertwined on an ontological level. They're connected. They're mutually constitutive. It's really hard to parse them out. But analytically, there's value, or I believe there's value in parsing them out, particularly when we talk about policy implications, where we want to have interventions, etc. So the argument of the book is essentially anti-reductionist. It's not saying that all these things are easily rarefied. It took me a lot of work to rarefy them, doing some ontological damage in the process. But the point isn't whether material inequalities or differences in symbolic resources shape which lines of action are available to us, but when and how one affects the other, when and how these shape our opportunities, our experiences as we grow older. And I insist that there is some value in parsing out which one is operative. To say it's complex is sort of punting on this issue of explanation. So again, some ontological damage, but that's done with the hope of producing analytical distinctions which are useful and I would say necessary in understanding how this works out systemically and where and how we might intervene. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Corey. So now I'd like to ask Sam Friedman, who's an assistant professor of sociology here at the LSE, to give his response to Corey's talk. Sam's research also focuses on inequality, in particular in relation to social class, and his current research is concerned with the operation of social class ceilings in elite occupations. I'll let you just take it away.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Corey, for an excellent talk, and also for inviting me to respond to your excellent book, which I've been reading with much interest over the last few weeks. And I must say that although Corey's given you a fantastic flavour over the last hour or so, inevitably, and as you saw, he's not able to cover the breadth and richness of the entire book, so I would certainly urge you all to get your hands on a copy. I know people probably have lots of questions, so I will keep this very short. I'll just make a few brief comments about the book, why I think it's important in the broader sociology of class and stratification, and then I just want to finish by posing some questions to Corey, which hopefully you won't find too difficult to answer. Just before I get onto the content, I just want to say something about Corey's prose. I must say it's really refreshing to read a serious piece of sociology that is so well written, where ideas are expressed accessibly but also with real clarity. But of course the book is also very timely. Here in the UK, with the baby boomer generation entering retirement, constant discussions about the burdens this will bring to the NHS. So it certainly addresses an important issue, and one that from my knowledge of the British sociological landscape at least seems to fit a fairly conspicuous hole. But it's not just a hole that Corey's filling here in the literature. I think the real strength of the book is the way in which Corey's able to use comparative ethnographic tools to really adumbrate how inequality plays out in everyday life and affects people in emotional ways, in psychosocial ways. As someone who works on inequality across both quantitative and qualitative methods, one thing I'm often frustrated with in my own work and other people's work is an inability to really get at the micro-political context in which inequality really plays out in people's lives, and how they themselves reflect the particularities and the histories of people's individual life courses. And I think throughout Corey's book, I was really struck by how he captures this micro dimension, particularly in the very effective way that you saw in the lecture, that he presents data in the form of contrasting personal stories from across his research sites, like running out of Ensure, why Jane skips chemo, or the way in which cultural resources or cultural capital can explain how respondents like Hattie and Lilith are able to get what they want from their doctor, but others like like Bernard, who's actually in a much worse health condition, was not. And I think the book is really full of these sort of rich ethnographic insights where observations are not just described, but very much systematically explained in terms of the inequalities in material, social, and cultural resources that exist between these seniors. I just want to finish by posing Corey 4 questions that struck me as I was reading. The first is that Corey mentions in the book, and again tonight, throughout his research in this area, colleagues have questioned the topic, asking why should we care about old people? And I too have detected this tendency in the UK, and I suppose I wanted to throw the question back at him and say, Why? Why is there such a fetishism, do you think, for youth in social science and society more generally, and why is old age so unsexy? Having just said that, it must be said that old people are becoming more interesting to sociologists more recently, particularly in the wake of Thomas Piketty's work, and more generally the focus on how inequality is accumulated over the life course and is then reproduced in particular through the intergenerational transmission or transfer or gifting of resources, particularly from parents to children or from grandparents to parents. And in Britain, of course, this is likely to be very much exacerbated by the Tories' pledge to eradicate completely inheritance tax for homes worth under £1 million. Now, the Tories claim this type of transmission taps into, and I quote, basic human instincts. So my question, second up, really picks up from this and asks whether your research revealed anything about seniors' attitudes towards passing on their resources, whether they felt this was just, and whether the ethnographic data on this topic might provide insights that people in this area would be interested in. The third thing I was curious on your thoughts upon, and that I didn't get that much insight from the book, was the significance of interactions between seniors. I suppose here I'm particularly interested in whether you detected any symbolic boundaries separating the way that different seniors saw each other. For example, lots of the work I've conducted with others here in the UK has shown that despite a public discourse of openness, cultural snobbery is very much still alive. And I suppose I've always felt that perhaps the best way to see boundaries in action, to see things like snobbery in action, is actually through ethnography, not through interviews. So I wondered if you could say a bit more about how seniors from different socioeconomic or racial backgrounds regarded one another, and whether there was any sign of snobbery or even reverse snobbery between them regarding lifestyles, health practices, and so on. And very finally, I just wanted to ask you one question about theory, and in particular your relationship to the work of Pierre Bourdieu. I noticed that throughout the book there are strong sort of nods to Bourdieusian theory and references to the rules of the game, the playing field, etc. And it's possible perhaps to read the main chapters as really about the structuring power of economic, cultural and social capital. But at the same time I sort of noticed that there wasn't any specific discussion about how the work was affected by Bourdieu. Perhaps you were leaving out theory from a book like this for obvious reasons of not boring people senseless, but and I'm aware that I might just be projecting here onto the book. So I'd be interested to talk a little bit more about how theory influenced your book and the place of Bourdieu specifically. But otherwise, thank you again for the opportunity to get an early view at this book, which I think is truly an excellent piece of research.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you very much. That's 4 questions, Corey. Can you address those fairly briefly, if you'd like, so we can open up the fetishism for youth in social science, the accumulation of inequality, interactions between seniors and Bourdieu, and then hopefully that will be a way to kind of open up for further questions.
Yeah, no, and thank you for the nice words and the great questions, and also reading the book at the end of the term, which I know is not the easiest time. Okay, well, I'll do my best to do this. I'm not, if you haven't intuited this, good at parsimony. It's not my strength, although I tried very hard in the book to be parsimonious, which included, cutting some of the theoretical points and putting them in footnotes, sort of like Weber, but not as good as Weber. So, question 1. Why is youth sexier than old age? So, or why does it have this connotation within social science? And when I say I had experiences with this, I give one in the book where I'm giving a talk. I go through the whole theoretical justification for looking at convergent experiences and the way people respond to different problems of social action and what that could reveal about mechanisms. I did that actually in early talks to a painful extent, and I still got asked the question, why should we care about old people? Which I find very problematic on a human level. I find it problematic on a policy level, given that we're aging, but as somebody that might be labeled a cultural sociologist, it's not something that I haven't thought about. So a couple of thoughts on this. One aspect, I think, has to do with the labor market, right? So in the case of the US, our identities are often closely tied to work or some other form of production, artistic, aesthetic, physical, and in later life, it sort of challenges that. There's the idea that children of the future, they're going to contribute, they're the inheritors of society, whereas when you're older, you're seen in many ways simply as a drain on the system. So there's a particular prejudice there, there's a bias. I think it also makes us uncomfortable because when we look at these things in later life, and some of them are very hard to look at, it's a sort of mirror of what we could expect. We're living longer, more of us are going to grow to be old than any point previously in history, whether that happens at age 60 or age 85. The end isn't always pretty. It doesn't necessarily lead hope, because by the time you could intervene, it's often too late. That being said, I think it's important on a theoretical level for the reasons that I mentioned. It gives us a lot of insight to the way these mechanisms of inequality converge and shape life, and certainly on a human and policy level. So you mentioned the baby boomers. There was a saying going around that it's like a pig moving through a python, right? That this is something, it's going to catch up to us. It's a pig, you know what a python is? It's a giant snake. And eventually we're going to hit this threshold where, as much as we try and ignore it, the accumulation of advantage, the accumulation of disadvantage is going to create major policy issues. And we have the similar debates in the US. We had a series of austerity measures that were implemented when I was in the field, and things that seemed really minor to those on Capitol Hill, like cutting off Meals on Wheels, a service that delivers food to people's homes, was a real hardship for seniors. And they would often say the safety net is there, but the net is thin, it's uneven, it's thicker in some places than others. So I think there are a lot of important policy things going on there. The attitudes towards passing on wealth, something that came up, wasn't really a focus of the book. The short answer on that is those with more stuff to pass on tended to be more in favor of policies that would allow them to do that. Now, this is conditioned on being in the Bay Area, so there were some people on the right, but it's a place in the US that's very far to the left compared to the mainstream. So you probably saw, if anything, that was a conservative case, and people didn't like the idea of the government coming and taking money and wealth that they'd accumulated and distributing it to people that were less responsible than them, even among the liberals in the Bay Area. So what stratifies seniors' interactions, right? What are the points of moral and symbolic boundaries? So this is something that was really, really interesting to me. I touched on some of it, but it wasn't, the prime focus. So interestingly, something that didn't come up, and again, this may be a case of the Bay Area context, is people saying, oh, well, I don't like that race. Something you might see in the American South, or that you might expect. There was a lot of talk about seniors who had it easier in life, right, that had all the advantages or had the money, which often had a racial dimension. So the seniors that grew up in the Bay Area, that were white, that were middle class, had a series of advantages that James necessarily did not. But when they talked about it, to even invoke race, in many ways, offended both sides of that group. If anything, the talk was about, who had opportunities, who had resources. But there were a number of other points where people drew symbolic boundaries. So the one that I talk about in the book, probably most clearly, is this issue of who's responsible, this issue of values. So when you say I'm somebody, they wouldn't say I'm a person that attempts to maximize security or to preserve the body, but they didn't see whether maximizing longevity as a thing to do that was randomly chosen, that was on the same level as other things. They saw it as the only way to act. It was common sense. So when people would see someone like Jane skipping chemo, they would say, that woman is nuts. They would say she doesn't, understand that she's being irresponsible for her family. And this wasn't just, about an interpretation. It was how they positioned themselves in that field relative to other seniors. So I have this section where I talk about the case of distinction, mentioning Bourdieu, with dope pills and pot, and the way that people sort of separate themselves from one another. Another aspect has to do with the body, again. And if you want to ask, when you hit 80, what's going to structure your life chances more than anything else? The first thing that comes to mind is whether or not you're in an institution. So if you're in this regimented setting where you can't really go out, you're in a sort of Goffmanian total institution, that's not only going to be seen as lower status, but you're going to have fewer possibilities. But even within the senior center, people will say things like, I'm able to move around better than that person, I'm 85, they're only 70, but they're losing their marbles. And so this, rather than, say, race, is what people actually use to stratify themselves. You see a lot of, if you go sit in on, is bingo big here? Yeah, go watch some of this stuff play out. I spent a lot of time playing bingo. I never got good at it. It was always like just the most stressful thing. I could only play 2 cards. But watch how some of these things play out over mobility, over space, over who's able to play 2 cards as the sort of village idiot, if you will, which I'm perfectly happy with. So I think the body and the capacities, what this signifies, actually becomes a major point of stratification later in life. And so coming back, and a little time, to Bourdieu and, to what extent is this a Bourdieusian study? What does it have to do with the forms of capital? First, I would say that I find Bourdieu incredibly useful. I find him very insightful. He says a lot of things which one could see in my book, but the sort of the flip side of that, the flippant comment, is he also says a lot of things. And some of those things are unclear. Some of them are contradictory. Some of them lump together different forces in a way that is not necessarily amenable to this sort of analytic comparative process. So if I had to choose one theorist, and I would say who comes closest to explaining the endgame, it would probably be Bourdieu, but given my approach, I don't have to do that. The way that I do it is there are, theoretical problems out there, right? What is the link between culture and action? What are the various material and symbolic forces that stratify later life? There are a number of people, much smarter than I, that have written on these, Pierre Bourdieu included. I look at what they have to say. I look at what others have said empirically about these same topics, and I see if I could sort of add to that. So my contribution is not, a taking down of Bourdieu or an extension of Bourdieu. It's showing that here are ideas, some of which have empirical utility in understanding the distribution of behaviors we see at the end of life, and some less so. So I try not to pick a patron theorist and extend their work, so to speak. I try and take a more pluralistic, middle range approach.
Thank you, Craig. So we've got a bit of time for